Welcome to Andy Staples on 3. I'm back. Refreshed. It was a wonderful week of vacation. I actually watched a lot of college baseball. We'll talk about that a little bit because there's one game left in the 2023-2024 school year. We got to talk about what did I miss? Well, I didn't miss any of the baseball because I was watching it all. That's the beauty of when you're at the beach, when you're going fishing, when you're hanging out on the beach. You're pretty much drained from the sun by the middle of the afternoon. So you just come in and chill, watch some College World Series, and then you're good. And the College World Series provided a lot of drama early. You had the 3 walk-offs in the first 3 games. Texas A&M and Tennessee did kind of dominate their brackets, though. They did leave suck a little of the intrigue out of the week by dispatching Florida and Florida State as quickly as they did. But they did play 2 fun games over the weekend. That one yesterday was pretty spectacular because you had kind of a pitcher's duel going on, and basically Jace Laviolette's home run in the first inning was the only offense, and Tennessee kept putting runners on and stranding them. And then finally Tennessee breaks through with a 2-run homer from Dylan Dreiling in the 7th. They add a Cal Stark homer in the 8th to make it 4-1. And now we have a winner-take-all game on Monday night for the national championship, the last college sporting event of this season. The last one. Next week, Texas and Oklahoma are in the SEC. USC, UCLA, Washington, and Oregon are in the Big Ten. Everything changes. One more game. One more game. Justin Lampkin for A&M. Xander Sechrist on the mound for Tennessee. 7 o'clock Eastern time. That's it. John Schultz in the chat. Huge recruiting weekend. I think we're going to see a ton of Hayes Fawcett graphics this week. I think you're right, John. We're going to talk about that as the week goes on. We're going to bring on Steve Wiltfong this week. See if there are any Fong bombs incoming, because there's a lot to talk about on the recruiting front. A lot of dominoes falling, a lot of class of 2026 QBs starting their dominoes. So this will be a very interesting recruiting weekend. Joseph pointing out August 2nd is the Big Ten move day. Yes, you're right. July 1st is the SEC. So for Texas and Oklahoma, they are moving to the SEC. Now, we all know they're moving to the Big Ten anyway, but yes, that is the date that the others are moving. So my bad on that one. But we got to talk about one other story I missed. One story I missed that was very interesting. There was not a lot of crazy news last week, but the one that popped on the bottom line, and I was like, huh? Les Miles suing LSU in federal court. Yes. Remember, LSU vacated 37 Les Miles wins. It was part of an NCAA penalty, the Vidal Alexander case. He was an offensive lineman that played for LSU from 2012 to 2015. So 37 Les Miles wins got vacated. Now, what that did is it changed Les Miles's career record from 145-73, which is a 665 winning percentage, to 108-73, which is a 597 winning percentage. And if you remember my rant about Mike Leach a couple weeks ago, you have to have a 60%, a 600 winning percentage to qualify for the College Football Hall of Fame as a coach. So Les Miles now does not qualify for the College Football Hall of Fame as a coach. And now he's mad, and he would like satisfaction in the courtroom, and either financial damages or get his wins restored. Now, well, here's the interesting part about the Les Miles situation. Remember, LSU was not his last job. He took the Kansas job. Remember, Jeff Long, who was the AD at Kansas, used to be the AD at Arkansas, was hell-bent on hiring Les Miles. Hell-bent. He wanted Les Miles to be his coach. He tried to hire him away at Arkansas when Les was at LSU. And basically, Jeff Long cooked up this way to fire David Beatty at Kansas, tried to fire him for free which didn't work out because David Beatty took him to court and used something that Les Miles' staff was doing to get himself paid. It was a complete disaster when Les Miles went to Kansas. Complete disaster. There was a TV show. Most of the episodes got shelved. But here's the thing. He went 3-18 at Kansas. So had he never taken the Kansas job, even if LSU had vacated these wins like they did, he would still be eligible for the Hall of Fame. Had he never taken the Kansas job, his career record with the vacated games would be 105-55. That's a 656 winning percentage. So all he had to do was not take the Kansas job. But as the commenters are saying, Christopher Jordan, those games still happen. Yes, they did. I don't really think much of vacating wins. I don't think that does much. Willie says the Les Miles lawsuit will get Leach into the Hall of Fame due to new rule changes. So he is suing the Hall of Fame as well. That is one of the defendants. And Christopher says the 60% rule is so incredibly dumb. Well, and I think this is the example here. So Les Miles takes the Kansas job. It drops him below. Like the Kansas job was an incredibly hard job. Now, I would argue that it didn't prove that Les Miles is, or at that point in his career, was a great coach because he was fairly terrible at Kansas. And Lance Leipold has been awesome at Kansas. So what does that say about where those two are? But it does kind of feed into what we're talking about with Leach. Like Leach, for whatever reason, didn't get the easy jobs. He got the hard jobs. And his winning percentage was lower because of that. And so Les Miles took a hard job. So what does that do? I mean, if you have good coaches who want to get into the Hall of Fame, I would think twice about taking that hard job as a last job of the career. I don't think I would do it. So I don't know. It's just, it is a very arbitrary number. The Leach thing, his contributions to the game, I think outweigh not hitting that arbitrary number. Irk Russell's still not in the Hall of Fame because of that same reason. You know, if Irk Russell doesn't coach at Georgia Southern, maybe, well, I don't know. But it is very weird, this whole thing. And the weirdest part is, let's say they change the rule or he gets the win. He's not going to get the wins back, but let's say they change the rule. The debate at that point over whether Les Miles should get into the Hall of Fame would be really interesting because the people who would be most against it are LSU fans. Like that was a weird dynamic. Remember in 2015 at the end of the season when LSU's administration floated, hey, we might fire Les Miles. It's possible we're going to fire Les Miles. And everybody outside of the LSU fan base is like, what are you doing? Why are you going to fire Les Miles? And the LSU fans are like, we've been begging you to do this for 3 years now. What took so long? And they were so disappointed when Les rallied the troop, basically rallied his political allies, including the governor at the time, Bobby Jindal, and kept the job only to get fired early the following season. But that would be the interesting debate because I was reading a Reddit thread. And again, if you're not on the CFB subreddit on Reddit, get there, join that community as well. That's a really good college football community. But it was kind of party lines, like LSU fans like, I don't know if he needs to be in there. And then everybody else like, of course Les Miles belongs in the Hall of Fame. So it is a very strange dynamic with LSU fans and Les Miles. But I do understand what they're saying is he should have done more with what he had at LSU. I remember saying that when he was up for the Kansas job. He couldn't do more with more. And now you want him to do more with less, no pun intended. So it's just a very strange dynamic. But we'll see. If it gets the rule changed and gets Mike Leach and Irk Russell a chance to get in there, and then we'll see what happens with Les Miles. Because, again, that is a weird debate there. But we'll see what happens. One more thing before we go. John had mentioned the big recruiting weekend this weekend. It's been going on all month. You've had big official visit weekends. You've had some commitments. I mentioned the class of 2026 QBs. If their dominoes have started to fall. But also the attack on USC's 2025 recruiting class. That has been one of the more interesting subplots. And remember, we had Steve Wiltfong on a couple of weeks ago, and he said, watch this because this is going to get very interesting. And this is after Isaiah Gibson had visited Georgia. Isaiah Gibson is a very good defensive end from Georgia. Now, it's interesting that these three guys are all from the state of Georgia that I'm going to mention. So Isaiah Gibson decommitted last week. Our recruiting prediction machine, pretty confident he's gonna wind up at Georgia. Also, Justice Terry, a defensive lineman from Manchester, Georgia, who was a part of that recruiting class at USC. He's the number 7 overall recruit in the On3 industry rankings. He decommitted. He visited Alabama last week. Now, our RPM, very confident that he will also wind up at Georgia. The other one is a guy we've talked about quite a bit, and he's been committed to USC, but we've talked about him essentially as an uncommitted recruit, and that is Julian Lewis, the quarterback from Carrollton, Georgia. He was in Boulder, Colorado this weekend, and for all the fun we make of Deion Sanders for not making the in-home visits and not making the in-school visits, they put on a show when you come to Boulder. They put on a show when a recruit comes to Boulder. So Juju Lewis goes to Boulder. He's got a burger named after him. There's a photo of him sitting on a throne in a Colorado uniform as Shedeur Sanders is handing keys to him. I'm guessing, I think, does Shedeur drive a Lambo? Bentley? He drives something very nice, and he's handing his keys to Shedeur Sanders. And Juju Lewis tweets this: could it be, quote unquote, perfect timing? And tags Deion Sanders, Shedeur Sanders, and Colorado Buffs football. So Juju Lewis still committed to USC, but he's visited Indiana. He's now visited Colorado. Auburn is still in hot pursuit. But listen, this Boulder visit was some serious stuff here. The Sink, legendary burger restaurant in Boulder, named a burger after Juju Lewis, the Juju Lewis Precision Pass Burger. 2 patties, cheese, bacon. We're all good here. Red onion, don't need it. A1 aioli, which doesn't make much sense. The aioli is going to cut the A1 to a point where it doesn't taste like A1 anymore. And it's also churched up mayonnaise. So we don't need that either. So Juju, if you do commit to Colorado, if you do flip and end up signing with Colorado, go to the Sink, tell them, get the aioli off my burger. Get the onions off my burger. We can do better than this. Heinz 57? Maybe some Heinz 57. But that will be a very interesting situation to watch going forward, because that USC recruiting class was in the top 5. It's now number 11. But we were talking about, hey, they are getting top 100 defensive players to commit to them. And that's what they've needed. Lincoln Riley has not signed players like that at all as a head coach. He has just not been the kind of coach that can get those players in bulk. That's what Kirby Smart does. That's what Ryan Day does. That's what Nick Saban did. That's what Kalen DeBoer is continuing to do at Alabama. That is how you compete for national titles. That's what Dabo Swinney did to build up Clemson. For all the talk about the receivers and the quarterbacks, their defensive line factory at Clemson has been incredible. And that is the problem. Stevie Davy, the real question, what kind of cheese on the Juju Lewis Precision Pass Burger? I believe it's cheddar. I'm good with cheddar over American for sure. Like good melted cheddar. Perfect. All right. We got to talk about our main topic today. Jesse Simonton joining us because he spent last week examining potential Heisman candidates. We haven't done the Heisman conversation yet. And Jesse, we need to have the Heisman conversation on this show because we keep talking about retraining our brains. 12-team playoff, everything changes. I think it also changes the Heisman Trophy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, first I want to say, I think Juju, if he wants to get that A1, aioli off, he should just go in and say, "Get the Juju off my burger," and they should do whatever he wants. No, but thanks for having me, Andy. Yeah, I mean, I think the Heisman conversation in 2024 and beyond now is going to look much differently than it has in the past. Now, I think you and I are both in agreement that until proven otherwise, until these voters actually show that they care about the entire sport and not just the guy throwing the passes, it's still going to be the Davey O'Brien Award 2.0. But I do think it's going to be a bigger pool of players, and I think that's probably where we can kind of start this launching point from. That it's still going to be quarterback heavy, but I think actually more quarterbacks may have a chance to win the award than in recent years.
Well, all right, so it definitely is quarterback heavy, and anybody who says otherwise is just not paying attention, because so you got Devontae Smith winning it in 2020. That was a very unique situation where you had a receiver who was that dynamic, who we all recognize is the one who makes this offense truly special, which is interesting because the same year, I think Kyle Pitts did essentially the same thing at Florida. Now, Mac Jones and Kyle Trask both wound up being finalists for the Heisman. Pitts did not. Smith won it. But you think about Smith in 2020, Derrick Henry in 2015, I remember being kind of the only logical choice as he was kind of carrying Alabama at the end of that season. And then 2009, Mark Ingram. These are the last non-quarterbacks to win, by the way. These are all the last non-quarterbacks to win. 2009, Mark Ingram. I didn't think he was the best player at Alabama that year. I thought Rolando McClain was the better Alabama player, and Ndamukong Suh was the best player in the country.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the ones that people have pointed to for years. That Suh's performance in the Big 12 championship game, many believe in hindsight that should have won him the award, and it did not. Just 2 years ago, I mean, Will Anderson had 17 sacks and 30 some odd tackles for loss and didn't even get invited to New York City. So again, thus far, the voters have proven unserious that they will really consider anything except for a quarterback. Now, spinning this forward, we're 2 years in a row, Andy, with Caleb Williams and Jaden Daniels. These are the first two quarterbacks since Lamar Jackson to be a Heisman winner that has not made the college football playoff. Before that, it was just a run-on guys that were, going to the championship games or going to the semifinals. And now that we have a 12-team field, I think you're going to see even more of these 9-3 type, potentially 9-3 team type quarterbacks winning the award. So if it is an Avery Johnson that wins the Big 12 and leads K-State to 10-2, but maybe, Georgia's undefeated or whatever, if Avery is as magnetic and just awesome as people think he could be, he's the type of guy that could kind of come in and steal the award.
Well, and I think that's so. This is the interesting. I don't think it's just do you make the college football playoff, because by that point in the voting, you only got 1 day left to vote. Now, I do think most of the
if you're just in the mix,
yeah, right, and being in the mix, so you could be 8-3 or 9-2 going into the final week of the season and be in the mix, and I think that adds a lot more, because that's what, like, would Jaden Daniels have? Would LSU have made the playoff last year? I don't think they would have.
I don't think they would have. No, they would not have.
But I think Jaden Daniels still would have won. Right. And because his numbers were so much better than everybody else. But I do think that this will, open it up to those, but we'll close it off to other people. And so I want to visit one in the chat, because this is one I find very interesting. JLR has mentioned this. He's about 6 times in the chat. He's saying that Travis Hunter is going to win.
Okay, let's wait. Before we have this conversation, Andy, I want to posit this to you. Before we start deep diving down the candidates, I want to posit this to you.
Okay, go for it.
We have just discussed that we think the pool of Heisman contenders, possibly, whether it is a Travis Hunter or if it's more quarterbacks, is going to be deeper than in seasons past. Right. But at the same time, have we killed the Heisman Trophy ceremony as we know it?
Oh.
because it is a week before the 12-team playoff starts. It is on December 14th. It's actually 6 days. The first game is actually that Friday, not even a week. If we think more guys who are in contention for the playoff spots may be the guys involved in the Heisman Trophy ceremony, are we really going to have this whole banquet circuit and song and dance week in New York City anymore? Or are teams going to say, we got to prep, we got a game. We got a game next week. We can't go up and has the Heisman Trophy ceremony as we know it. Is it totally gone? Is it going to be totally different?
So I think it depends on how tight the race is. We haven't had a really tight race in a little while. Like when you actually are nervous, wondering who it's going to be as they read the name, I think people are going to watch. But last year, it was clearly going to be Jaden Daniels. Like there was no, you had your Bo Nix fans and your Michael Penix Jr. fans, but you knew it was going to be Jaden Daniels. And look, part of it is we have these straw polls with media organizations that have a lot of Heisman voters, and they don't allow you to publicly reveal who your Heisman vote was. But when you have these straw polls like a week before or the day of, where it's anonymous, but they've got 25 voters, like it's a pretty representative sample. So you kind of know who's going to win.
So that's not what I'm actually asking. I'm asking less about who may or may not.
Oh, you're
win.
talking about, yeah. Oh,
well, they actually go to New York City. Well, we actually have Chris Fowler sitting down and interviewing these guys. If Bo Nix last season is having to play a game in 6 days,
that is
Dan
a great.
Lanning.
I didn't even think about
and Bo
that.
Nix really going to go spend 48 hours in New York City when they got to be preparing for a game?
No, this is private jet.
Saying.
Yeah, private jet in for the ceremony, and then you're back out. Like that's all it is.
The days of Troy Smith getting fat and happy on the Heisman banquet circuit, that's over. Right? That's over. I mean, like these guys. He still
wasn't getting away from Earl Everett.
You go there for, like you said, maybe. I mean, there's no way. It's not even a 12-hour experience. These coaches, they don't want to waste, a second.
Yeah.
So I just think it's kind of an interesting offshoot that.
That is fascinating. I didn't think about that because I was thinking about it as from the viewership experience.
Right. No, I'm talking about from their perspective. Like, are you even going to are they going to have guys zooming in to be like, give me my Heisman because
because the player may just be like, I'm not leaving. I got a game. Right. And it's funny because you hear the stories about the old days. Remember Barry Sanders was in Tokyo when he won the Heisman because they played a game in Tokyo. Yeah. The stories about Steve Spurrier when he won the Heisman in 1966, apparently so Norm Carlson was the director of publicity for the University of Florida at the time. May he rest in peace. He just passed about a month ago. But Norm gets a call from New York and basically calls Steve Spurrier like, hey, you won the Heisman Trophy. Like, that was it.
We're gonna go back to it. I'm telling you, it's all coming full circle. So I just wanted to raise that before we talk candidates, because I just thought that was an interesting offshoot.
Christopher Jordan raises another question. So before we get to individual candidates, let's talk about this, because maybe this is what needs to happen, because we've talked about this before. Christopher says, agree, just move the ceremony to after playoffs. Why don't we move the vote to after the playoffs?
Yeah, and I think that's something that is long overdue. They just seem so kind of, deeply embedded in their ways that I'm skeptical that's going to happen. Because it's funny, too, because all these sports treat these things differently. The MVP for the NFL gets awarded like a couple of days before the Super Bowl. Yet in the NBA, we're seeing Dirk and these guys accept the award after their team gets bounced from the playoffs. So it's always it's kind of a mismatched deal with how all these leagues award what they is the kind of the ultimate prestigious award.
Well, and it's so New York centric too. Like the idea of going to New York, like you could theoretically just give it out where the national championship game is. So even if you got a guy who's playing the national championship game, you can put him in the Tahoe and drive him over and have the ceremony. But they're not going to do that. They're going to have that ceremony in New York, which is interesting because they don't even have it at the Downtown Athletic Club anymore.
That in New York, as someone who lived there for several years, that most people in New York don't give a hoot about college football. So there's always been kind of an irony about that.
Well, it's the same day as SantaCon usually. So all you have is a bunch of drunk Santas walking around Midtown Manhattan, and then there's like they're giving out the Heisman Trophy.
Then it's like, oh, there's Derrick Henry walking around with a bunch of Santas.
All right. Let us talk specific candidates. And I want to get into this Travis Hunter question because before we talk about the quarterbacks who probably have the chance to win it, Travis Hunter is one of the most interesting players we've had in college football in a long, long time. The first real true two-way star in years. Because like Charles Woodson won the Heisman in 1997, was playing some receiver, but he was not a full-time receiver. He was not the kind of two-way player that Travis Hunter is. Like, my thing with Travis Hunter is if he is their wide receiver one and has like 1,500 receiving yards, that's probably too many. If he has like 1,200 receiving yards and is their best corner and is really good all season, even if they're 6-6, like he's got to be on a ballot.
Yeah, I think, and I had in my top 10, because I did them by each power conference, and then I released kind of an overarching top 10 at On3 this past week. I had Hunter not in that top 10 overall, but I had him as kind of the dark horse candidate for this exact thing that you just kind of laid out. And I think it also helps Travis Hunter that he's a guy that he's going to have the story that, he spurned Florida State and went to an HBCU, then followed Dion to Colorado. He's the guy that's the cover art athlete for the new EA Sports game that everyone's so excited about. So if all that momentum then kind of materializes into the kind of season that you laid out, I think his candidacy would be legitimate. And then it would kind of be, is it good enough to tip the scales over if a quarterback, also kind of has a really dynamic and amazing year? That's TBD. But I think that Hunter, of all the guys that are non-quarterbacks, he easily, Andy, has the best kind of arc plus story plus potential equals, dark horse candidacy. Like, I don't see it for a guy like Ollie Gordon for the big picture. If you're breaking down like I did Big 12 candidates, yes. But when you're talking about it from a national perspective, I think there's a lot bigger hill to climb there for a guy like Ollie Gordon or some of these other tailbacks.
Well, you got yelled at about Ollie Gordon because you did your conference by conference columns last week, and then you did a top 10, and you didn't have Ollie Gordon in your top 10. Now, Ollie Gordon was the best back in college football last year. We're assuming he's going to be the best or one of the best backs in college football this year. One thing I will throw out, especially if you're looking at Big 12 futures, this is something to consider. Oklahoma State may have the oldest offensive line in the history of college football this year. So that bodes well for Oklahoma State and for Ollie Gordon, any sort of Heisman candidacy or just statistical measure. Ollie Gordon's going to be good this year.
And if you make the case for Ollie, it's that, he didn't even become like the guy for Oklahoma State until week 4 last season. And then he rushed off and ended up leading the team leading the nation in rushing. Now, the flip side of that a lot of Oklahoma State fans don't seem to be willing to acknowledge is that because they kind of put so many miles on him in one season, Gundy decided, hey, let's give him some help. And they brought in multiple really interesting tailbacks out of the transfer portal. So it's still going to be the Ollie Gordon show, but I think they're going to kind of, ease some of those carries to some other guys, which again, if you're a running back in these days, Andy, I think the threshold minimum is a 2,000-yard guy that's leading a team that's making it to the playoff.
Yeah, the problem for running backs, and this is as the game's evolved and quarterbacks run more, is there will be quarterbacks who throw for 3,000 yards and run for 750, 1,000. So your 1,400-yard rushing season compared to that just does not look that great. Like what? Here's a guy, and you've talked about this guy as one of your potential winners, Jalen Milroe at Alabama. Jalen Milroe has the potential to be a touchdown machine. because of how athletic he is in the run game. He's going to throw for a bunch of touchdowns in Kalen DeBoer's offense. But if he's fully unleashed as a runner as well, he could have, Tebow, Cam Newton type touchdown numbers if he has a really good year. Like, that's going to be pretty hard to compete against if you're a running back, if you're a receiver, if you're anything else.
Exactly. If you're talking about a guy who could, top 45 total touchdowns, because Kalen DeBoer has proven at various stops that if he has a guy at the quarterback position that has some wheels, he'll run them, and he'll run them a lot. And I think with those other tailbacks, with Justice Haynes and Jam, they're gonna be a team that kind of leans on that big offensive line, which had two of the best transfer additions, and getting the Boomerang Proctor and then the center from Washington. So I think Milroe could easily have 45 touchdowns, and you're just not competing against that if you're an Ollie Gordon, even if you have 2,000 yards and 20 scores. That looks really good. Looks really good. But that looks really good in 1999. In 2024, when these quarterbacks are doing what Jaden Daniels and some of these other guys are doing, it's just apples to oranges.
So do we think it's probably going to be an SEC or Big Ten player? It feels like the hill to climb for the Big 12 guys and the ACC guys and then everybody else is pretty steep.
Yeah, I mean, you really have to. I think you really have to pick some nits. Here's the one exception, Andy. Because there's been such bubbling hype around this team all off season, and there is kind of like a feast or famine feel, I think, with a lot of folks about the Miami Hurricanes. Cam Ward is probably the exception to that. It's going to be a Big Ten. It's going to be an SEC guy, because Miami's going to start high enough in the polls where they're going to have some shine. They obviously have the huge Week 1 game against Florida, but they haven't, because Mario hasn't done it yet. If Cam does become kind of the guy that is the prince that was promised and
right,
kind of brings them home, I think Cam Ward, and he's a guy much like Jalen Milroe that could have 40 total touchdowns. He doesn't have quite Milroe's upside athleticism, but he will run. And so you get him some red zone scores. Miami has some running back concerns as is. So if he poaches some of those touchdowns and then throws, Miami hasn't had a 3,000-yard passer since 2017, which coincidentally or not coincidentally, Andy, is the last time they won 10 games. So, if he kind of helps them break through that glass ceiling, I could see him being the exception there. Otherwise, we're talking about a Quinn Ewers, a Milroe, a Beck. Dylan Gabriel's going to be up there. I'm skeptical that I think Will Howard's odds are super inflated. The fact that he has the 4th best preseason odds seem kind of crazy to me when he hasn't even been named the starter. But as I wrote, I mean, that's kind of what you get when you become the quarterback for what many people believe is the 1st or 2nd best team in the nation.
Yeah, it really, they're looking at the roster around him. And the most interesting dynamic to that is there's a reason Will Howard is at Ohio State and not back at Kansas State, and that's because Kansas State is starting Avery Johnson. We have 2 of these situations because Dylan Gabriel's not at Oklahoma because they're starting Jackson Arnold. And I don't think Jackson Arnold is a better quarterback than Dylan Gabriel right now, but they're looking at the ceiling. They're looking at how much eligibility is remaining. Avery Johnson, same deal. And you had the situation last year where they tried to kind of force Avery Johnson into that role. Will Howard wouldn't give it up necessarily. So that one's going to be an interesting dynamic. But the Will Howard thing, he has so much talent around him. It's very hard to not look at that and say, well, he could put up some big numbers. But let's go to the situation that he left. Avery Johnson, who I'm telling everybody now, you have not seen a quarterback this fast since Lamar Jackson. Now, I don't know if he can throw like Lamar Jackson. We have not seen that yet. We've seen a couple nice throws. That's all we've seen so far, a couple nice throws. It's not like the year that Jackson took – when Jackson was a freshman, he had basically the whole back half of his freshman year where he took over that Louisville offense. Louisville was like Bobby Petrino's tweaking things. And by the end of the season, by the time they played Texas A&M in that bowl game, the offense was then built around Lamar Jackson. And you saw in the bowl game exactly what it could be. Avery Johnson started the bowl game because Will Howard had already left, but they've changed. Like Colin Klein goes to Texas A&M, the OC. They bring in Matt Wells, who's going to work with him. Now they've promoted from within as well, so they've got some continuity there. But we have not yet seen that offense built around Avery Johnson yet. We haven't seen him have a chance to be the thrower that you need to be to put up these numbers.
Yeah, and they obviously brought him some help. Kansas State, I think, really upgraded at playmaker. They brought in, Dante Cephas didn't work out at Penn State. I think he may find a better feel there with the Kansas State Wildcats. And then they brought in Avery's buddy, from Colorado, the former Pee Wee teammates. And that's a tailback room that's going to give him a lot of support because they bring back the number 2 rusher in the Big 12 there as well. So we haven't seen him throw the ball yet, Andy. I'm as high as him. You and I are both super high on him. I mean, he's going to be one of the, you know what, when people are going to realize how fast he is, Andy, is when they play with him on the NCAA game.
Yes.
And they're like,
agreed.
He's just zooming past people. And it's like suddenly everyone is playing with Kansas State more than they've ever played with, a program like that before. We're watching a thing of Nico here. Avery Johnson, Nico, Jackson Arnold, these sophomore phenoms, they're kind of all, I would say, sleeper candidates, but they fit. You got to bring in this conversation full circle. I think they fit really well into a lot of years. Maybe if they lose a couple of games, they probably wouldn't be in the mix for the Heisman. But if they're as mesmerizing and kind of electric as people expect, if they're 10-2 or 9-3 and their team is in the mix, they have a shot. They could have the quote unquote sex appeal or the appeal, the Q rating that maybe a Carson Beck doesn't have, or people are like, we've seen Dylan Gabriel. Let's give it to the new flashy thing.
Chicken 15 and 15 in the chat correcting me. We have seen a quarterback as fast as Lamar since Lamar, Kyler Murray. Let's give Kyler his flowers on that. But Avery Johnson is in that category in terms of speed. The question is he in that category in terms of arm? We don't know that yet. We'll find out. But let's talk about Dylan Gabriel, because you mentioned him. Jackson Arnold takes over at Oklahoma. That sends Dylan Gabriel to Oregon. So Dylan Gabriel, similar story to that of Bo Nix, where he comes into Oregon, where Oregon's kind of a fully formed offense, very good offensive line, lots of playmakers around him. But I would argue that Dylan Gabriel was more successful in his prior career than Bo Nix was before he went to Oregon.
Yeah, no argument here. No argument here. And now he's going to have the best supporting cast he's ever had. I mean, he's going to be playing behind an offensive line that I think is probably second or third best in the Big Ten. Maybe even first. I mean, I think they're certainly better than Ohio State's offensive line, which I had a column this past week. I think that could be kind of the one bugaboo for the Buckeyes. But I mean, Gabriel led the Big 12 last year in his first season. In every single category. So passing, yards per attempt, touchdowns. He's a guy, again, he's not going to run a ton, but he'll poach some scores. And so if he could easily get 10 touchdowns rushing, and that just adds to the figure. So the stats are going to be there. Obviously, Oregon's loaded at receiver with Trayshawn Holden. They bring in Evan Stewart, the 5-star from Texas A&M. You bring back Tez Johnson, who was kind of the big transfer portal hit a year ago from Troy. It's very easy to kind of build the potential for Dylan Gabriel's Heisman candidacy. Now, again, are folks going to say we've kind of seen him put up these stats at UCF and Oklahoma, and so maybe they won't be as impressed with it? I don't know, but I mean, if he leads a team that could be, as good as any in the country, it's hard to overlook that.
Yeah, and you look at that offense. We had Will Stein on the show a couple of weeks ago. He's working to kind of mold the offense around what Dylan Gabriel does best as opposed to Bo Nix. But the things Dylan Gabriel does well are already what Bo Nix did well at Oregon in terms of he's accurate. The lower yardage passes he's extremely accurate on. So like you're talking about a high 70s completion percentage with playmakers and also the ability to run. Now Bo Nix is a good athlete too, but there is so much to like about Dylan Gabriel. I thought it was an interesting here's an interesting point from Angel in the chat. USC QB Miller Moss will surprise and lead his team to 10-2 and the CFP. Quick release, accurate, and a good decision maker. He's a sleeper on no one's Heisman watch list. Fight on. Angel's a USC 78 grad. I am not opposed to this take at all. I watched Miller Moss in that bowl game. He looked spectacular. And what do we always say on the show? We never worry about Lincoln Riley's offense. We just worry about his defense. Like Miller Moss, I would imagine is going to have a good year.
I mean, look, there's no quibbles here. And I did not have Miller Moss on my top 10 overall list. But on the Big Ten list, I had him listed as the wild card candidate. And I basically said, I mean, it's probably pretty smart to put a Lincoln Riley quarterback on any of these preseason lists, even if you are skeptical maybe of Miller Moss's upside, because of just Riley's history with the quarterback position and getting these guys to either win the award or become a Heisman finalist in New York City. Like you mentioned, I mean, Miller Moss had a monster bowl game, throws 5 touchdowns, but then he struggles mightily this spring, has a terrible spring game, and you know, they bring in Jaden Maeva to potentially compete for the job. So I think it's more likely that he loses his job to the UNLV transfer than actually wins the Heisman. But he at least merits mention because of Lincoln Riley's history with the position.
They also open against LSU. It'll be our first look at Garrett Nussmeier as the full-time LSU starter. And that's like a pure old school thing. Well, Carson Beck, I guess, at Georgia had that situation last year where you had the guy who waited his turn behind the really good quarterback, and now he finally gets his turn. So Garrett Nussmeier, another one to potentially watch. Let's talk Carson Beck, though. We haven't talked Carson Beck yet. This is the guy who we said Will Howard's up there because he's got this great roster around him. Carson Beck has the achievement of being the full-time starter at Georgia last year, looked very good. Maybe the top NFL prospect, draft prospect in this class. And, oh, by the way, the roster is pretty awesome around him.
Yeah, honestly, Andy, I would say that the biggest demerit potentially against Carson Beck is that typically Jaden Daniels notwithstanding last season, because he actually was the preseason favorite. Most of the time, the preseason favorite for this award just simply isn't the winner. You know, they might be in the mix most of the year, but, you know, folks get sour if there's one bad performance or one bad game. They'd rather, you know, boost somebody up if, say, a Connor Wegman, you know, leads Texas A&M to a surprising season, or like we mentioned with the Nico or a Dylan Gabriel, if he kind of, you know, leads Oregon to new heights. But I think, I mean, Beck, it certainly seems like the stars are aligned for him to just have a monster senior season. He returns to school. Georgia's upgraded the receiver position. They lose Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey, yes, but you get Lovett to come back to school. You get Ra to come back to school, and then you bring in Colby Young from Miami. You bring in Trevor Etienne from Florida to play tailback. The weapons that he's going to have at his disposal. You bring in the kid. I know Jim Nagy is really high on the tight end from Stanford. You know, and so there is no shortage of weapons and playmakers at Carson Beck's disposal. He's not a guy that turns the ball over that much. I think you could see Georgia need to actually air it out a little bit. And the fact, Andy, that as dominant as Georgia's been the last couple of seasons, they haven't lost a regular season game in a couple of years. They're going to be tested this fall. And so if Carson Beck can lift them up in a game at Texas, in a game at Alabama, I mean, these are going to be primetime opportunities. He shows out in those games, then absolutely he deserves to be kind of the number one front runner for the Heisman Trophy.
When you look at that Georgia schedule and you see possibilities of Heisman candidate versus Heisman candidate. Now, we don't know exactly how they're going to perform early season, so whether they'll be in the mix at that point, we don't know. But he's got to play against Milroe at Alabama. He's got to play against Quinn Ewers at Texas. He's got to play against Jackson Dart at Ole Miss. We haven't talked about Jackson Dart yet, but Jackson Dart, if Juice Wells is healthy, like Juice Wells and Trey Harris could be the Brian Thomas and Malik Neighbors to Jackson Dart's Jaden Daniels this year.
Yeah, with a Jordan Watkins who's playing the Kyron Lacey role. I mean, they're and they've Lane decided, Lane chose violence with the transfer portal in the trenches there, because not only he looked at what happened to them in that Georgia game last season and said, not only do we need to recruit basically a completely mercenary defense, but if we want to have any hopes of actually getting in these, battle royales with these big boys, we have to upgrade on the offensive line. And so they just grabbed as many as they could. And they said, hey, let's let the chips fall where they may. The best guy's going to play. They held the competition over the spring. We enter summer, with continued competition there. I mean, they're going to start a bunch of transfers in the offensive line. Several of the guys from Washington, they've grabbed some other. So, I mean, Dart, again, you talk about support and the pieces around him. Ole Miss is very well positioned there. And Dart's a guy, again, bears repeating, he can do it both ways. Jackson Dart can, he'll run and he'll throw his body into the fire and take
that's the part I'm worried about with him.
Yeah, exactly. And somehow Jaden Daniels survived, so we'll see if Jackson Dart can do so similarly. But the Ole Miss thing is, for him, he's going to have to show out in Ole Miss has a favorable schedule this year. It's up right now on the screen. He's going to have to show out in some of those key games at LSU, Oklahoma versus Jackson Arnold, and then the big game versus Georgia in that late November setting.
So Nathan in the chat asked another interesting question. Are there any freshmen who could shock the world and end up in New York? Not necessarily we're assuming they end up in New York. That's as Jesse pointed out, that's a different question. But yeah, could there be any true freshman finalists? We still haven't had a true freshman win the award. It's going to happen at some point, just because you have these freshman QBs who come in. Nathan is a Nebraska fan, so I know where he's nudging us.
I was going to say, I mean, Dylan Raiola is easily the top candidate, and that's because, again, you put in potential plus story and the arc that if Nebraska, which hadn't gone to a bowl game in 6 or 7 seasons, not only finally tops that 6-win plateau, but is maybe a Big Ten contender. If he gets Nebraska to the Big Ten championship, then Dylan Raiola would probably, based on how that would likely have to play out, obviously Tony White's defense is really good there, but that would probably mean the freshman quarterback was the prince who was promised, and kind of the prodigal son coming home and leading them. Our producer here, River Bailey, is shouting out the number 1 player, Jeremiah Smith. I think that's kind of a thing that he'd be great if the receiver position didn't seem to be fairly watered down in terms of how Heisman voters have viewed that spot in recent years. And so is he going to be – I think he's going to be awesome, but I would be skeptical that he is so dynamic that people think that he is the absolute best player on a loaded Buckeyes team.
You have to be utterly dominant. And Christopher mentions a freshman, but not as a potential winner this year. He says, hot take, Cam Coleman will win the Heisman his sophomore season next year. Cam Coleman, the Auburn freshman receiver this year. So he's talking about a Cam Coleman for Heisman campaign in 2025. I do think Cam Coleman probably has a chance to make a bigger impact on Auburn than Jeremiah Smith has to make on Ohio State, because Ohio State already has some other dynamic. Like, they got Emeka Buka, they got Cardinal Tate. Cam Coleman could be the threat at Auburn. So, like, that of the freshmen, even though Jeremiah Smith might wind up being better, we'll see. They're both really good, but Cam Coleman might make the bigger impact as a true freshman.
I guess the guys that did you think it was interesting, or do you think I missed the mark, Andy, that I didn't list any defensive players on any of my lists other
No,
than Travis Hunter?
no, because I don't think there's a Will Anderson, Aiden Hutchinson. Now James Pierce, maybe James Pierce puts up those kind of numbers, but I think teams are definitely game planning around James Pierce. He's going to get chipped like crazy. It's hard to, like, Will Anderson had that problem his last year too. Like, it is hard when you have a great season as an edge rusher to have another great season as an edge rusher. Because that's
well, I also think if say Pierce is awesome, and I think Pierce is fantastic, and we've seen him, listed in the top 10 of a ton of NFL mock drafts. I just don't think I don't if he's really good, that means Tennessee's probably really good. I just don't think he gets the credit. I think Nico, even if Nico's numbers aren't otherworldly, would be the guy that most voters would likely turn their eyes to. Will Johnson is being mentioned here. Michigan's teasing that he may play a little bit of running back. We'll see. I don't think you want to, injure your first round cornerback when secondary depth seems to be a potential problem up there in Ann Arbor. But Will Johnson is a guy that, they could certainly try to sell it as Charles Woodson 2.0 if they allow him to return kicks and he plays a little bit of offense.
And Kenneth Grant and Mason Graham are fantastic players who, and if you ask an NFL scout, they'd be like, well, those are two of the top 5 players in college football. But that they're not going to be considered because we just know they aren't.
Yeah. And same for, I think that a transfer, Nick Scorton, he's a guy who led the Big Ten in sacks a year ago. I think he could have a monster season for Texas A&M because he's going to be playing opposite Shamar Stewart, Shamar Turner there in the middle. I mean, Texas A&M's defensive line, for even losing Walter Nolan and some of the other pieces they lost, is still going to be fantastic. If Scorton has 17 sacks like Will Anderson did, I think people would say, hey, that's a top 5 pick, not, hey, that's a top 5 Heisman candidate. Even if that is deserved, even if I'm not saying that's not right, wouldn't merit being a top 5, but just the way the voters have taken this award, and that's just not the way it goes.
No, and my thing is, when I vote for the Heisman Trophy, I take what happened this year, because you're only allowed to consider what happened this year. And I say, if I were starting a college football team from scratch, based on this year, who would be the first pick for me? And I'll be honest, only once has that been a defensive player. That was Sue. My first year as a voter, I had Sue as the number 1 guy on my ballot. I've had quarterbacks most years. I had Derrick Henry the year he won. I didn't have Ingram the year he won number 1 on my ballot, but I did have Derrick Henry number 1 on my ballot. Actually, I take that back. No, I had Deshaun Watson number 1 on my ballot that year. Deshaun Watson, his sophomore year. So I had him number 1 and Henry number 2 on the ballot. But
and you had Caleb over Will Anderson too.
I did. I had Will Anderson on the ballot. I had Will Anderson over Aiden Hutchinson because he had a better year than Aiden Hutchinson. Right. But it's tough. It is very tough to not pick a quarterback because they have such an outsized impact on the game. So it's probably going to be a quarterback. And, one other freshman I'll point out to answer Nathan's question, because I was looking at freshmen who maybe aren't in line to start immediately, but might wind up being the starter. Damon Williams Jr. at Washington. That's one that I have people keep telling me, watch this guy. He's going to be awesome. Now, Will Rogers is at Washington. He committed when Kalen DeBoer was there. Jed Fish talked him into staying. So Will Rogers, who started at Mississippi State for 4 years, he's the presumed starter at Washington. They haven't named a starter yet, but I'm just Damon Williams Jr. Maybe this year isn't his year. Maybe it's later, but this is one that people keep telling me, watch this guy.
That's a good one. I would say a couple other deeper pulls. I think if a Noah Fafita The fact that they stuck again, some of this is both storyline, arc, narrative, and then what do you do from an actual production standpoint? Noah Fafita, the fact that he stuck around, he stayed loyal to Arizona, didn't go bolt with his head coach, to his best friend Tiatori McMillan is still there at wide receiver. If Fafita leads Arizona, which had been just a doldrum program, to a 10-win season as a freshman, and then this next season, leads them to a potential Big 12 championship in their first year in the league. He's a guy that I think, in terms of his odds are way lower than a bunch of the other guys we've talked about. But I think now in the new 12-team playoff, if Arizona goes 10-2 or 9-3 and they win the Big 12, he's a guy that could really warrant some consideration.
Well, one other guy, and this is I missed this in the chat. It's way far up, so I can't find it now. So I apologize to who made this joke, because it was a good one. They asked if Cam Rising is still eligible at his advanced age. Yes, Utah quarterback Cam Rising still eligible despite being about 37 years old. But that's another one that whoever leads the Big 12 champ, whether that is Avery Johnson, Ollie Gordon or Alan Bowman, Cam Rising, Noah Fafita, Shedeur Sanders, whoever it is, Jalen Daniels, I think that person gets serious consideration.
It's funny because I had Rising as like a little thing. I made a little note about him in my Big 12 Heisman top 5 list. Because he missed all last season. He's 2 for 2, Andy. If he the last 2 years he was healthy, he won Pac-12 championships. If he wins 3 in a row, that's a pretty good storyline to kind of start as a base. Now, will the stats be there? That's probably what's going to ding Cam Rising the most, because he doesn't put up the most prolific numbers in comparison to some of these other quarterbacks.
Kyle Whittingham is not about compiling stats. He's about cinching you down and winning that game.
He's about compiling dubs, which he's done. He's done a lot of. But Cam Rising, at least, I'm glad you mentioned him, because he, of all these 7th-year guys, he would have an interesting story if he leads the Utes in year 1 to a Big 12 championship, which would be 3 titles in 3 seasons.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating how this all works this year. There's so much to chew on, and it does feel wide open. Like now I will say, whoever in Vegas was on the Jaden Daniels train this time of year last, because this is when he made the move in the odds.
Yeah.
They were smart, because I don't think I would have said, I probably would have said, okay, I think Jaden Daniels is going to have a pretty good year. But I don't think I would have said Jaden Daniels is going to post historically great numbers. And they nailed it. They absolutely nailed it. So watch the moves, watch those line moves, see what happens these next few months, because that was an interesting one where, like you said, the betting favorite going into the season rarely wins it. But Jaden Daniels made a move in kind of like June, July, August that we didn't see coming.
Now Jackson Dart's going to do it, and then he's going to end up zooming in, because he and Lane can't fly up to New York because they got to play that first weekend or January 21st, first weekend of the playoff.
Lane on the Zoom is going to be spectacular. On the Heisman Zoom. Oh, this is great. Jesse, thank you so much. Now you've given us more to think about. Another new wrinkle every time we talk about this season.
I told you, man. I tell you, yeah. Thanks for having me, Andy.
All right. That's the great Jesse Simonton of On3. The Heisman race is going to be fascinating this year. Now, it may be somebody we didn't even mention who just runs away with it, because that happens sometimes. It just happens. Somebody comes out of the blue. Like Johnny Manziel was redshirting at Texas A&M. We didn't have nobody even had him as the starter. Maybe some Texas A&M insiders this time that year had him as a starter, but remember, he got into trouble. And so nobody knew what he was going to be. There may be somebody out there like that this year, but we will find out. Now, one other thing that happened during the week I missed, and this was definitely a slow news week thing. This was definitely one of those deals where people who work for college football, social media accounts, just decided to get busy and have some fun because there wasn't much going on. So last week, there was some Twitter account that incorrectly stated that Tulane had the cheapest beer in college football. So Tulane advertises this. Cheapest beer in college football. Come see us at Ullman Stadium. Well, naturally, this ticks off some people west of Tulane on I-10. The people at Louisiana Lafayette. The actual cheapest beer in college football. That's right, $2 Natty Lights when you go watch the Raging Cajuns play. But then everybody else decided to jump on board. It escaped the state of Louisiana, and the beer argument kept rolling. Missouri's like, we have cold beer too. We also have a playoff contender. Come get season tickets. Charlotte, with its Gold Rush lager, the goldest lager in college football. Pittsburgh, the freshest Iron City Light in college football. I think they're the only stadium serving Iron City Light, but neither here nor there. UMass has its own beer, Massachusetts Lager. The best lager in college football, they say. UCF, the most buzz in college football, because apparently they sell buzz balls at UCF. That's right, you can get a cappuccino buzz ball at the Bounce House. Now at BYU, they don't sell beer. But they do advertise the coldest chocolate milk in college football from the BYU Creamery. Not to be outdone, New Mexico, the hottest green chili in college football. Let's go get some Hatch chilies. Mississippi State, the best cheese in college football. Now, that was quickly pounced upon by the people at Wisconsin and at Washington State who believe they have the best cheese in college football. But I guess we'll have to sample some cheese and find out. And, of course, the best one of these, Hawaii, the best Spam musubi in college football. What is that, you ask? It's essentially a sushi roll created when you have a bed of rice, a piece of Spam over the top, and you wrap it with seaweed. That actually sounds pretty awesome. That'd be a pretty good game day snack. They love their Spam in Hawaii. I know what you're thinking. Spam? No. Maybe you haven't had enough Spam in your life. Just telling you. Look, Spam doesn't sponsor this show. If they would like to, I can tell you who to call. But Spam's pretty spectacular. I'm just telling you that right now. I get it. It's in a tin can. It makes the weird sound coming out. You're thinking this can't be good. No. Fry up a piece of Spam. Eat it plain. Make a sushi roll out of it. However you want to do it. I promise you will not be disappointed. You also will not be disappointed with this show the rest of the week. We are back in the saddle. We are going. Is there a ton going on in college football right now? Yes, in the recruiting world. So, of course, we will have our friend Steve Wiltfong on this week to talk recruiting. We got to get our buddy Philip Dukes back. We haven't had him in a while. We can talk some recruiting with him. Also, got to get ready for Texas and Oklahoma heading to the SEC officially on Monday. And then, oh, by the way, the last college sports event of the 2023-2024 school year is tonight. So we'll talk about whoever wins the baseball championship tomorrow. Texas A&M and Tennessee, 7 p.m. Eastern time. Plus, you've got a Game 7 in the Stanley Cup Finals. A lot of winner-take-all going on Monday night. You'll be winners if you show up here on Tuesday morning. We'll talk to you then.